Story 1. Was diagnosed with depression and anxiety. Repeatedly became unresponsive to antidepressants after initial success. Turns out I have bipolar 2 and was experiencing months-long depressive and manic states. I went on a mood stabilizer 3 years ago and have had no manic or depressive episodes for about 3 years now after oscillating back and forth for almost a decade. My mental health and quality of life have improved tremendously. Story 2. Emphysema. I was told I had about 3 to 5 years of quality life left, and then about 2 to 5 years after that on an oxygen bottle. So, 10 years life expectancy total. That was in 2005. Maybe I was just out of shape? Story 3. My late partner was incorrectly diagnosed with gonorrhea, despite no history or indication and a negative test, at the emergency room. He died 55 days later of metastatic cancer. Story 4. Diagnosed with bipolar 2. Went on Seroquel extended release. It wasn't helping. The doctor kept increasing the dose. I don't remember exactly, but I want to say we reached something like 600 to 800 milligrams. It was excessively high. I felt like a shell of a human. I did the irresponsible thing of just stopping the medication and quit seeing that doctor. Years later, I was in a new state and saw a new doctor who diagnosed me with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I've been on Adderall and similar medications for about 5 years, and now I'm about to graduate college. Story 5. My dentist told me they needed to break my jaw and realign it for an overbite when I was a teenager. It turned out it was completely unnecessary and I'm fine, other than being ugly, but that's totally unrelated. Story 6. My friend was diagnosed with anxiety, pneumonia, asthma, and bronchitis for over a year. It ended up being stage 4 lung cancer at 34. They were never a smoker. My dad was misdiagnosed with pneumonia multiple times. It was stage 4 lung cancer. He was never a smoker. Story 7. I was having chest pains and went to the emergency room. The pain was right where my heart is, so they first thought I was having a heart attack. After clearing a heart attack, they took my list of symptoms and the fact that I work in public education and misdiagnosed me with tuberculosis. My wife had to put on a full bodysuit to visit me in the hospital. I was in an isolation chamber with an airlock room for entry for 2 weeks before they cleared me of tuberculosis and moved me to a regular room. It turned out to be valley fever and pneumonia eating at my lung. Story 8. I was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder at age 7 and was medicated for it until I was 23. I got a psychological evaluation when I was 17, and it said I am on the autism spectrum and have high anxiety but show no signs of having bipolar disorder. I was still heavily medicated for bipolar disorder for another 6 years and had doctors tell me it was my fault the medications weren't working, and I was called a liar more times than I can count. I am 29 now, and many of the bipolar medications I was on as a child and through puberty are no longer given to children because of how strong they are and the risks of long-term side effects. My metabolism is also messed up, and I have serious trust issues with doctors, but I am working on it. After years of taking unnecessary antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, antidepressants, and more, I only need to take one prescription sleep aid. Story 9. Not really a diagnosis, but I was basically told they knew I was drug-seeking. I had an ovarian torsion and don't use drugs. Obtaining healthcare while female can be infuriating. Story 10. Called repeatedly for a persistent fever and eventually difficulty breathing after I had my son via emergency cesarean section. The midwife told me regarding difficulty breathing that I probably was having anxiety, and regarding the fever, my milk was coming in. It turns out I had a massive infection that required multiple antibiotics and brought me close to going to the emergency room, which would have left me alone without my baby due to the COVID pandemic. Urgent care refused to treat me and threatened to call an ambulance. Why not just have me come into the office for a quick check before it got this bad? Story 11. I was misdiagnosed with a glioblastoma on my brainstem. I was given a life expectancy of 3 years. That was almost 20 years ago. I was subsequently diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which I stopped taking medication for about 9 years ago after my MRIs hadn't changed. I went to see a new neurologist in October, and he said he didn't think it was multiple sclerosis. I was recently diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, though, and don't have the time or energy to follow up with the neurologist. Story 12. I have transverse myelitis, mostly recovered. My first neurologist thought it was multiple sclerosis. While the spinal tap was awful to test, it's better than the daily injection I was going to have to do. Thank goodness for second opinions. Story 13. I fell on December 16th and repeatedly told doctors my back hurt. They took an X-ray and said they didn't see anything. I suffered through the holidays and then requested an MRI. On February 6th, they said there was a sacral fracture with bone marrow edema. They gave me a back brace and said to take Tylenol. I have Aetna Preferred Provider Organization insurance, which has been emailing me about how I can save on my next test if I drive 40 miles out. I'm pretty sure they mean save them money. Story 14. Long story short, I'm 7 months pregnant. I had plans to go shopping for baby stuff with my mom after grabbing lunch. While doing my makeup, my eye felt numb, and I couldn't feel my eyeliner on that lid. It was weird, but so is pregnancy. Whatever. Mom picked me up and we sat down for lunch. Lunch was dribbling down the side of my mouth. I called my obstetrician, and she said to go to the emergency room just to get checked. A CT scan showed funny gray areas in my brain. I was admitted. 2 weeks of baby monitoring and neurological tests followed. It wasn't Bell's palsy. This was confirmed a dozen times. We can't do the tests we need until you have the baby, they said. I was released from the hospital. 2 days later, I couldn't feel the baby moving, so I went back to the hospital. I was induced early with 17 medically necessary people in the room, rushed to a C-section. Before I could even lay eyes on my baby, I was in a full-body MRI with contrast, a spinal tap, and blood tests. Several weeks of follow-ups passed. The numbness faded. It's not multiple sclerosis. It's just a gray spot on my brain. Don't worry unless the symptoms return. My baby is now a perfectly healthy 17-year-old. Me and my gray spots still muddle through life. Story 15. A pierced belly button. No, really. Except it was actually a very rare form of endometriosis, umbilical endometriosis. The doctors accused me 4 times of piercing my belly and lying about it. They even made my mother leave the room to try to convince me it was safe to tell them. I was literally pleading with them to listen to me, saying that I'm not a moron and I have professional piercings. Why would I lie about a belly button piercing? I was also covered in professional tattoos at the time. I don't see why a 24-year-old woman would be lying about that. They were all very young male doctors, and they acted like frantic teenagers. It was so infuriating. They sent me away with a piece of paper saying, "Patient denies piercing belly button." Pissed me off so much because I could barely move. It was a whole chore even getting to the hospital because there was so much pressure behind my belly button, and blood was oozing out of it. Story 16. Oh my goodness, let's see. First doctor, nothing is wrong with you. Your white blood cell count is fine. Second doctor, nothing is wrong with you. Your white blood cell count is fine. Maybe you are experiencing health anxiety. Third doctor, for an unrelated issue, why has no one referred you to infectious disease? There's something else wrong with you. Fourth doctor, finally infectious disease. You're the only person in North America to be diagnosed with this condition this year. I hope the treatment works and you don't die before the medication can eliminate it. And by the way, your white blood cell count is no excuse for others missing this. So, I was misdiagnosed with nothing and correctly diagnosed with something so obscure on this continent that I actually saw a doctor on the medical subreddit mention it. Story 17. They diagnosed me with depression and I thought it was accurate, but then I began examining myself more closely for a while and thought it would be wise to get myself tested for bipolar depression. And yes, I got medication, and now I'm normal as far as I'm concerned. Story 18. At first, they thought it was attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but it turned out to be autism. Now I'm happily diagnosed and living my best life, befriending other autistic people and living my authentic best life. Story 19. Not me but my wife, and this was just last year. Out of nowhere, she started having excruciating pain in her mouth around the area where she had a root canal done years ago. So she went to an emergency dentist. They took x-rays and diagnosed it as a failed root canal and gave her medication to deal with the pain until it could be redone by them. Then they proceeded to give her the runaround on actually scheduling the appointment to have it done. First, she shows up for the appointment they scheduled, only for it to be the doctor's planned day off. Then when she tried to reschedule, they told her they didn't have an appointment for another 2 months. She said, "Forget it," and went somewhere else to get a second opinion. The doctor took one look at the x-ray and one look in her mouth and saw a giant crack down the middle of one of her molars, and questioned how the other place missed something so obvious. They removed the tooth and she's been pain-free since. She tried to get at least some money back from the first dentist because they messed up so badly, and for them to drop the bill too. They kept saying no until my mother-in-law got involved and basically told them that if they didn't drop it, they were getting reported to the licensing board for gross misconduct. That got them to back down. In conclusion, avoid Aspen Dental at all costs. They are truly awful. Story 20, borderline personality disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, and anxiety. Borderline personality disorders seem very accurate, but I've outgrown it completely in my 20s and have none of the tendencies anymore. Actual borderline personality disorder doesn't just go away once you're in a healthy environment and relationship. Story 21. I was diagnosed with anxiety and being lazy and unmotivated as a preteen. At age 38, my new primary care doctor asked if I had ever been evaluated for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. After answering a few questions, he prescribed a low dose of Adderall. It was like the clouds parting and the sun coming out. The prospect of starting a big project doesn't make me want to cry anymore. I'm not constantly anxious about whatever it was I was supposed to remember. Story 22, borderline personality disorder. Turns out it's generalized anxiety disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, panic disorder, persistent depressive disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Separately, I was told I was malingering and a hypochondriac for years due to constant back pain and asking for answers. Guess what? Spondylolisthesis, spinal stenosis, and degenerative disc disease. Discs between lumbar vertebrae 4, lumbar vertebrae 5, and sacral vertebra 1 were completely disintegrated. Fusion surgery was performed. Now I live with chronic pain still because apparently the nerves in my back were essentially trained to only send and receive pain signals. And of course, the discs above the fusion are slowly disintegrating. Story 23. Anxiety from trauma that was clearly causing me to vomit undigested food and cause life-threatening weight loss. No, Deborah, it's not in my head. It's gastroparesis. My stomach is paralyzed. It doesn't work. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Story 24. Misdiagnosed twice in childhood. First, I was diagnosed with meningitis. However, due to lumbar punctures gone wrong, it caused ataxia for life. The second was more about a general practitioner. I was bruising oddly. The family doctor kept saying it was just me being a clumsy child and that my mom was being overprotective. The bruising gradually got worse to the point that even just a finger on the skin would leave tennis ball-sized bruises. That same doctor then tried to say my parents must be committing physical abuse. My mom reached out to my aunt in sheer frustration because no one would listen to her concerns. My aunt was a pediatrician who, prior to that, helped deliver me during her clinical rotations in medical school. After describing my symptoms, she immediately said, "Go to the hospital now." It turned out I had immune thrombocytopenic purpura. Daily transfusions and a year-long hospital stay took almost 3 years to fully recover. The side result is my veins are now scarred to the point that, for over 35 years, blood tests are a nightmare unless it's a trained phlebotomist. Story 25. General anxiety that caused heart stumbles and depression. I was told I have a protein deficiency and do not work out enough. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which, mind you, I had suggested as the cause before any of the other diagnoses were given. And again, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, seasonal affective disorder, suggested dissociative disorder. Wrong again, just bipolar disorder. Half of the manic symptoms were buried by my narcolepsy symptoms, though. A whole mixed bag over here now. Story 26. Recently, I found out I was misdiagnosed with panic disorder and attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder. The true diagnoses are borderline personality disorder and bipolar 2 disorder. How did they get that wrong? Don't ask me. Story 27. My obstetrician/gynecologist told me that my baby was 6 pounds, even though that baby should have been 5 pounds. Tops. The baby was 10 pounds, so he was a bit off on that one. Story 28. I was misdiagnosed with endometriosis. It was scar tissue from my appendectomy that had wrapped around my colon. I was diagnosed with pregnancy or herpes. It was an allergic reaction that was close to Stevens-Johnson syndrome. I was misdiagnosed with, it's in your head, anxious woman. It was hypermobility. Story 29. When I was 16, I worked as a nurse's aide. I was exhausted and not feeling well, but there was an elderly gentleman I would stay after work to read to. One evening, I fell asleep while reading to him. I later ended up in the emergency room, where the doctor told my mom that I was just seeking attention. My parents were not happy with me. Despite feeling terrible, I pushed through and went to school on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I was so drained that when a very nice but annoying guy got on my nerves, I hit him in the head with my chemistry book. Completely out of character for me. That night, my mom made spaghetti my favorite meal, but after just one bite, I went straight to bed. By Friday, I refused to go to school. My right arm wasn't working properly, and I couldn't stand up straight. In the car, my mom handed me a comb and told me to fix my hair. I ran it through my hair once, then dropped it onto the floor. In that moment, she knew something was seriously wrong. It turned out I had pneumonia in one lung and pleurisy in the other. I was admitted to the intensive care unit, where I remained for weeks. Doctors from the Mayo Clinic even traveled to my city to see me. Eventually, I was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the lung. Tuberculosis in the United States was declining overall due to antibiotics and public health efforts, but it remained concentrated among urban poor, older adults, men, immigrants, healthcare workers, and those with weakened immune systems. The decline in tuberculosis cases stalled in the mid-1980s before rising again in the early 1990s, partly due to the human immunodeficiency virus and acquired immune deficiency syndrome epidemic. After 3 months in the hospital, I was finally discharged, weighing just 89 pounds. My entire high school, along with my siblings' grammar school, had to be tested for tuberculosis. I had contracted it from one of my patients. Unfortunately, the illness also affected my heart, leading to heart surgery 3 years later. During the procedure, there was a complication, though I was never told exactly what happened, and one of my lung lobes had to be removed. I was placed on a ventilator in the intensive care unit for a long time. Recovery was long and difficult. To this day, I deal with chronic chest pain, but I've learned to live with it and don't take any medication for it.